I'm really sorry for today. It's been hard for the past 2 days. Okay, no, it's taller than me. I give up. Okay. Is it okay? Is it start? Okay. I think we can all agree that gig economy can be pretty shitty, but when we think about journalists, the people who are supposed to be delivering the news, not only deciding on your voting choices of tomorrow, but also people who are literally going into wars or like life and death situations and being scared of into doing things or not doing them, we tell you that leaving them in a situation of no safety and ultimate exposure to no funding plus no backup from the traditional employers is absolutely horrendous. So firstly, let's talk about what freelance journalism is today, and then secondly, what is our proposal alternative that has been happening before. So we tell you that freelance journalism is a couple of things. Firstly, it can be you being a journalist, educated or not, we don't particularly care. It's more likely that you're not going to be educated because education is something that is usually an employment requirement. That is probably like writing opinion pieces or articles and then sending them to multiple papers and asking, do you want to publish me? This is a draft, blah, 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 blah. Secondly, it can be also that you're probably having like smaller publishing houses, or even that you're a completely like self-autonomous freelancer yourself, meaning that you're running your own blog, Instagram page, or something else. Basically, all of the principles apply to gig economy, so you do not have a contract, which is our model. You're not working for one company, which is constantly sourcing you, paying for your probably like healthcare, legally backing you, etc., holding you under one NDA, and probably investing you as an employee in the future. Now, because this is not a complicated model, let's just get into the main thing, and that is the news simply gets worse in a world in which you have freelance journalism. 6 mechanisms why. Firstly, we tell you that journalists are much more prone to go for sensationalist news and content in a way in the world in which they need to be freelance. We tell you that this is so because insofar as you're not working for one BBC or for one New York Times, who is giving you the name and the recognition in the journalist world, not only now that you're writing for them, but also later when you seek another employment, what you need to do is you need to get published as many times as possible, and that's usually only through breaking news. So that is the reason we're probably more likely to follow false leads, cover up when something doesn't fully add up, and cover something, etc., etc. It doesn't have to be false news. It just can be you chasing as fast as possible your famous journalist, because there's no alternative to becoming a big brand and actually getting hired on daily basis by these big media houses such as BBC, NBC, CNN. I don't care. Secondly, we tell you that the shift the burden is shifted from the media houses to journalists in terms of who is going to fund the content and who is going to take care of it being big. Because the thing is, when you have a journalist who is in the charge of, I don't know, covering war stories in the Middle East, it's not really important. You as a media house are the ones who are going to follow up on their ideas, who are going to send them to the war zone, who are probably going to like psychologically test them, equip them with things, fund their 2-year-long search, etc., etc. We tell you that the point where you are a media house who does not have somebody for full-time in the office, what is probably going to happen is that you're putting a shift on journalists that they have to be the ones who are going to fund the research in the first place, or who are going to go probably unprepared to war zone, or who are just going to be rich, and meaning less opportunities for people who are not rich and who don't come from privileged classes, are probably less interested in the matters of not privileged classes to even get the story that is likely to be published. We tell you this is extremely bad. But secondly, we tell you that very deep investigative journalism is incredibly important. We tell you that like one of the big church sex abuse scandals happened in Washington some 30 years ago, when a couple of investigative journalists under one house went and published like big papers. We tell you that #MeToo broke after a 2-year-long research funded by NBC, by their like in-house journalists, but that all of these research are probably multi-year, lengthy, and require a significant amount of money, which means that only if you have a contract with your employee who is probably signed under an NDA and like non-competes and shit, only in that case you're gonna be likely to fund them. Not if there's some like kukalo who can go the other day and get employed by somebody else, or lead or leak the story, or you just don't trust them enough that they're not going to do it in the first place for more money. Thirdly, we thought that simple things such as funding journalist training, like their graduate schools or whatever, is something that is very big, which is just the money that is not coming from anywhere, or the incentive that doesn't come to the media houses insofar they do not know that they're going to have ownership over one journalist forever, and that money is going to pay off. Fourthly, we thought that there's a huge shift in bias and less burden in terms of actually publishing quality news once you have freelance journalists. Why is that so? Because if you have a big media house, if you have NBC, BBC, etc., there's a couple of things to notice here. Yeah, firstly, they have reputation. Their reputation was probably built on the years of publishing good news. Secondly, they probably have investors like boards of directors, even government funding in a lot of countries around the world, because this is not only a debate about the USA. What this means is that they cannot publish crap because they're probably going to lose their funding. I am aware that there's a Fox News out there in the United States of America. However, we thought that the situation gets much more shitty. No, thank you. Insofar as you have free journalists who do not have time or money to investigate their conspiracy theories. I know that there is going to be a lot of probably conservative people or even far left people, I don't particularly care for political orientations in this debate, who are going to want to publish radical things or false things. We do tell you that there are probably some conspiracy theories that might have some validity into it, but only the big media houses, even such as those as Fox News, are going to have the money and the incentive to actually invest in people in the long term whom they trust to discover these and not to just publish shit that is going to be read by readers. Fifthly, which leads me to the next logical point, that the shift of the perception of freelance media is much better in the world in which freelance media is a majority of media. Why is it so? Because already you have a lot of conservative people, a lot of anti-establishment people who believe that media is controlled by the Jews, Masons, or the liberal government in the United States. What that means is that at the point where you have free journalists on Facebook or blogs who are posting their own shit, you say, oh, okay, these are the people who are going to save me, so this is the reason why I'm going to follow them, I'm going to read them, and because there's a lot of them, and they might even get published once in that BBC, you're going to be like, okay, I'm more likely to read it, I'm more likely to believe it. But finally, when we talk about really big things, such as uncovering big government shit and wars, like Dick Cheney is sending people to Iraq just because he wanted to get more oil from Iraq and shit, we thought that it is significantly more likely that you're going to pursue your story and not get scared out by a lawsuit if you have a big media house behind you. Why? Because you probably have a team of lawyers, you have a fuck ton of money to go to lawsuits and fight them. If you're one journalist, it's not only that you can get killed and nobody's gonna fucking care because you're not employed, and because you're probably still not contracted for that story in the first place because you first need to write it and then send it to somebody else. But it's also that if you are threatened with a lawsuit, you know that your career is probably finished, which is the reason we're going to back off. And the most important pieces of journalism are probably not going to get published. For all those reasons, because journalism in the first place is here to, yes, influence our voting decisions, to essentially be an accountability check on the government, like the fourth pillar of government is media, informing people what the fuck is happening in the country. We tell you the only way to establish this is to go with our model, which is the alternative where you still have traditional employment and traditional safety for the journalists. For all these reasons, OG. Thank you.
Is everyone okay? Okay. I will be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In opening opposition, we provide two arguments. The first is to give you a characterization of why freelance journalism can provide viable quality journalism, and the second, what are the structural problems of being in a top-down media organization that deals directly with the 6 mechanisms we hear from opening government. First, the viability of freelance journalism. The large majority of the quibble coming up from opening government is this idea of funding and feasibility in terms of that being the analytical premise as to why we cannot get quality journalism. I want to give you a characterization of how freelance journalism actually works in status quo and the trend towards freelance journalism. We think that with the expansion of the internet and the virality of social media, it has become easier for you to just publish pieces of your own articles onto online platforms like Facebook or Instagram, and that allows you to get greater accessibility and viewership without having to go through the media of a media outlet. That is one example of how it can work and why you don't need the sort of resources and funding. The second thing to say here is that anyone with a laptop and views can simply pen your thoughts, so on and so forth. But the third thing to say is that we increasingly see a trend whereby a lot of these freelance journalists also have other jobs, right? So a lot of times they're writing in their free time. So students in universities, for instance, students in Singapore, for instance, right, writing on Rice Media about the issues that are most proximate to them. We think what this looks like is that perhaps we won't see a Western journalist in Afghanistan covering the war, but it's still likely that an LGBT individual would still want to cover the issues that are most proximate to them. It's still likely that an Afghan individual living through the horrors of war would still want to write about those issues. It's still likely that women who have suffered and faced a lot of problems, like things like the Me Too movement, can still exist on our side of the house. The difference is, instead of like a Western reporter interviewing the experiences of each individual woman, we want those women to tell their stories, to like write those type of op-eds, to write those types of journal articles. We think that is the preferable comparative. We are therefore going to show you that this increases the freedom and autonomy to write about the things that are most proximate to them, increasing the quality of news, but also the impact of the argument will be how we pierce echo chambers, and that will be proven later on. So I think that's just a broad characterization of why freelance journalism is able to work and why it is likely to be viable. So before I talk about like the impacts, I want to give you the six structural reasons as to why being in a media organization literally hurts the quality of journalism, and this deals directly with the 6 mechanisms OG gives you. I will flag it up. The first thing, OG says investors and a board of directors. That is exactly the problem. The reality is, for many media organizations, they're often owned by rich individuals. So we look at Rupert Murdoch owning News of the World, for instance, right? The problem with a lot of these individuals, therefore, is that a lot of these rich elites who have the money to be able to be the majority investor in new media organizations, oftentimes, therefore, have a disproportionate control over what you as a journalist can write, because they can appoint certain editors to write certain things. This means to say, if you have a rich individual, for instance, who has benefited from oil money, it's very likely that they're going to censor articles about the environment. They're going to censor articles about things like how oil is bad, at the point to which they have a personal vested interest in that. Because oftentimes, like, the amount of revenue they can make from oil, for instance, is far higher than any revenue they can make from viewership. That is the problem, right? So both sides of the house agrees that there's investors and board of directors. The asymmetry is that the investors and board of directors exert their powers in an insidious way. Mechanism 1. The second mechanism we will note here is that because there's editorial control, and because you require this as your traditional job, there is an incredible degree of power asymmetry, which means you're incredibly likely to kowtow to whatever your editors are likely to say, because you do not want to lose your jobs. But the third thing here, OG says, now we don't invest in journalism schools, right? So people don't have the educational qualifications. It's really bad that we privilege people of certain educational backgrounds in status quo. That exactly is the problem. The point in which the BBC or the Washington Post only privileges people of certain educational backgrounds and certain qualifications. So you only hire the white journalist, or you only hire like the Cambridge individual because somehow Cambridge is better than, other universities. I think it's just inane at the point to which the subconscious biases of people at the very top, because these are oftentimes rich individuals in their ivory towers. They themselves were from Cambridge. They themselves benefited from patronage networks like Eton, for instance, which means you privilege people and you privilege reporters of certain educational backgrounds. This means that a sort of diversity that OG wants doesn't exist at a point to which we systemically lock out different viewpoints. This also means that we see like the sort of jargon and language use being very privileged and inaccessible to the common man, which means that a lot of the stories oftentimes like shut out the lived experiences of the people who matter most, at a point to which people who work in the BBC and traditional media organizations oftentimes come from the top brass of society. But the fourth thing here, and this is what I want to do with the investigative journalism point. So, what is the problem with being in a media organization with huge commercial pressures? Is it more likely that you're going to sensationalize, or is it more likely, as OG says, you're going to engage in investigative journalism? Here are 2 reasons why you won't engage in investigative journalism if you have a profit incentive. No, thank you. Because A, investigative journalism is incredibly uncertain. There's huge cost and a huge amount of time that you have to spend like researching and like interviewing individuals about a particular issue. But the second is that it's just incredibly expensive, and like the risk towards you being able to publish it is also contingent on whether there's government backlash, so on and so forth. What this looks like, therefore, is that your commercial pressures are likely to incentivize you to simply sensationalize instead, to go for the most shallow, eyeball-grabbing news like Posh and Victoria Beckham, because you know that these are things that people care about the most. That is to say, media organizations therefore engage in a race to the bottom where they engage the most shallow, eyeball-grabbing news, which means the sort of diversity they want on their side of the house doesn't exist. But the last reason here, the fifth mechanism, is the idea of paywalls, right? Which means that media organizations, because of profit incentives, require things like paywalls, which means even if the Economist is good, even if the New York Times is good, the degree of paywalls means that individuals are unable to access this quality of information in status quo, which locks out a large chunk of the OG benefits. The upshot of this, therefore, is that media organizations, by virtue of their inherent structures, are unable to provide diversity of news, are unable unable to provide quality of news, but even if they're able to do so, they're unable to get access to the people who matter the most. Before that, closing.
Most of these things are uncomparative. You have both in status quo.
I mean, why is it uncomparative? Like, the 6 reasons I've given you show the asymmetry, right? Like, so, yeah. What are the impacts, therefore? I think there are 2 impacts that I want to talk about. The first, I think, and I think this might sound like a wild claim, but I think we have a greater propensity to pierce echo chambers. Why? The counterfactual on their side of the house is that people either read one media outlet or another. But the problem is media outlets are oftentimes entrenched in one viewpoint. So CNN, liberal bubble, Fox, conservative bubble. And the problem is once you buy into that, right, that's the only viewpoint you ever get. On our side, the world in which we reimagine with freelance journalists is that you might subscribe to different freelance journalists based on who you like, right? And the point here is you might have a liberal freelance journalism who is economically liberal. You might like a socially conservative freelance journalism. The point is when you're able to pick and choose individual freelance journalists that attach to who you want and like the most, you're able to have access to a greater variety of viewpoints rather than just being always locked into one echo chamber or the other. We get greater diversity. The last framing is this. Even if we agree that media becomes much less powerful on our side of the house as opposed to theirs, that's okay. Because we think it's insidious that the media can disproportionately shape your views in status quo. It's insidious that I vote for the Republicans because Fox tells me to do so, or I vote liberal because CNN tells me to do so. If the only harm on our side of the house is that the media can have less power to shape your views, that's good because people have greater agency to decide what's most important for them. Proud to oppose.
Sorry, just give me 2 seconds to set up. Everybody ready? There's a difference between Fox News and CNN being bad and telling you which way to vote, and then there is the horrible echo chamber of conspiracy theories that you will inevitably fall into once you start clicking on the different columnists that Alex Jones posts. Or on Facebook when you enter into a group that is purported to be a group of freelance journalists, but is really just like 30-year-old Facebook moms telling each other that the COVID vaccine is going to give your kid rabies. So the issue here is that there is a classic trade-off of quality, quantity, and which side achieves both at the same time. There are 2 clashes then that I'm going to go over that will cover why we win both. The first clash is going to be about what type of news that you're now going to get. What quality of media are you going to get? Second is going to be about the impacts on journalists themselves and why we ought to care about that as well. On the first clash then, about what type of news you're likely to get. Here, I'm going to go point by point and take down LO's stuff. So the first thing they say is like, it's easier to publish, there's more accessibility, look at Singaporean students publishing part-time. Okay, a couple things to say. First, obviously there is a trade-off between quality and quantity, but the issue here is that if they argue that it is so accessible that anyone can post, then it can only be one of 2 things. Either it is so accessible for everybody to post, and so there is a huge degree of competition, and your article gets absolutely no views, and you end up making maybe 50 cents, no thank you, for every 6 hours of laborious research that you put into an article. Or you are more likely to, I don't know, like, push yourself to sensationalize what you're saying in order to get that competitive advantage. So because of the low barrier of accessibility, we are likely to say that A, either you're going to get really, really low returns on really good quality work, no thank you, or you're going to get really horrible work at really high returns. Second thing they say is, well, you want the Afghan women to write about their own issues. Yeah, and I want unicorns to exist. Like, clearly there's still going to be some people on the ground that are writing about their issues, no thank you. And that is going to exist on either side of the world. This is not this house prefers freelance journalism to institutional journalism, but opposes the trend of growing freelance journalism. There will always be people that engage in freelance work regardless on both sides of the house, no thank you. Second, interviews exist. Afghan women can easily tell their story as well if approached by an institution. The next thing they say is basically there's 6 mechanisms that I'm really just going to condense into one point about majority investment. I have about 3 different responses. So the first thing that I want to point out is it's not as bad as they pointed out to be. There are a couple institutional mechanisms that prevent this from happening. First, in many, many places, especially Western liberal democracies, there are oftentimes things like fairness doctrines or standards of media that you have to be held to account in order to even get fucking published in the first place or exist
exist as an institution. You've had to have decades of reputable journalism in order to exist in a world that is ever changing and ever more competitive. Second, there's also a check and balance between the other journalistic places that exist. So for example, if, I don't know, like, ABC News writes some really horrible piece, New York Times is going to go, well, actually, we have the better quality journalism. Here's a longer, better article with more facts and more citations. So there is also an incentive to compete within the same houses, which means that you're also likely to get like slightly different or nuanced views based on a different topic. Second thing that I want to point out is that a lot of institutions also exist that are nonprofit or publicly funded. So obviously there are things like The Guardian, which are heavily donation reliant and often cover groundbreaking work like environmental law and human rights. We recognize, yes, that's probably not the majority of institutions that exist. However, this is a trade-off we are willing to take because it is unclear what the impact is on their side of the house. Maybe one or two more oil companies don't get called out. That is true. But on their side, they are also the one pushing conspiracy theories that led to the January 6th Capitol insurrection. So it is unclear why that margin, also given the fact the other things that I've talked about like why there's competition and why people want to expose each other, like clearly we're willing to sacrifice the 10% less coverage on oil companies, even if that means we can get better journalism overall. The last thing that I want to point out is basically there's stuff about like paywalls and investigative paywalls is the last stuff I'm going to talk about. So the first thing is that many of these companies oftentimes do not paywall their work. See, for example, The Guardian, or you can access a limited amount of articles before reaching a limit. Or, you know, things like LibGen exist, things like Reddit exist, things like disabling JavaScript exist. Try it, it works at home. And before I go on to the second, and before I talk a little bit more about investigative journalism, I'll take the point from closing.
Yes, we think right now traditional media is dying, continuing to die. It's good to the
Yeah, so it's dying because of the rise of freelance journalism. And this leads into my second response, is that the reason why there are firewalls is because these institutional media companies are now losing people to freelance journalism, to really, really horrible quality articles that people can read that think that the same quality as institutional articles, which is why they then default to freelance journalism. So a couple things on investigative journalism and why it's important. Basically, they say, well, no one's actually going to do investigative journalism because there's a huge risk. So first, institutional checks and support means that you literally just get more support for investigative journalism for a couple reasons. First, money and time. It is often a multi-year $100,000 investment. The counterfactual is, even if there are less people that do it, even if there are, maybe instead of 100 people, we have like 75 doing investigative journalism at The Economist, the counterfactual is that barely any freelancer is able to do it. Maybe 1 out of 100 if you're a trust fund baby. Because it means that individually, you have to weigh the opportunity cost. You're not going to be able to meaningfully write about anything else. Job security, if this doesn't work, your $100,000 investment is not going to have any returns. And also, it oftentimes means that you're not even willing to take that risk in the first place. Whereas, The Economist has hundreds of thousands of dollars you can pour in. They have connections all over the world. They have exposure to all of the other people that work in global divisions and other headquarters. They have an entire research unit dedicated to producing this sort of stuff. But it also means things like travel support and connections. And here I'm going to get more into about how it affects journalism. Basically, it means that when you go to a war zone, you have someone who can lead you around. It means that you don't take the risk of going to a war zone on your own because you think that's what's going to make you clicks and that's what's going to make you competitive in an ever-globalizing world. So what this means is that journalists are less likely to take stupid risks for their own safety and are actually more likely to stay alive to produce good journalism. So for example, you can see like the Vice journalist that went to Somalia to cover Somali pirates that literally got kidnapped. So clearly this is a large impact. This also means that the vast majority of people that now go into journalism are people that know they can succeed because like you get $10, you get 10 cents for every article you write. At the end of the day, OG's impacts are this. Investigative journalism is one of the only ways that we can genuinely expose otherwise deeply kept secrets. See, for example, Ronan Farrow breaking Me Too on The Times and being able to uncover a literally decades-old scandal that plagued Hollywood. This is the type of investigative, groundbreaking journalism that only OG can talk about. And second, the quality of journalism overall also goes up. At the end of the day, quality over quantity, we're very proud to propose.
Just to check, can you hear me from the back? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. I first want to point out some problems in opening government, and then secondly, I want to give you some direct responses, and lastly, I want to weigh Hanyang's material to explain why the impact in this debate is so important that we take it right from the get-go. First things first. Problems with opening government. I think opening government fails to ask the question of why this trend is even taking place in the first place. The reason in which there has been a decline in interest in traditional media to begin with is because individuals have realized that it's incredibly insular. That oftentimes it covers a lot of elitist viewpoints that are inaccessible to the average human being on the ground. Even when it does try to cover like more niche topics, it's oftentimes covered by individuals who do not fully understand or have the lived experiences to represent and document it in a way that is meaningful to the vast majority of society. I think that's something that opening and therefore now closing has to contend with. Two problems therefore. Firstly, I think opening government is uncomparative. The presumption here cannot simply be that singular media organizations are perfection. To that end, I would suggest that the inability to respond to any of the mechanisms that Hanyang gives you is a problem. But secondly, the OG presumption in their case is that money necessarily translates into journalistic integrity and quality. Hanyang breaks that deadlock for you by explaining to you why we get better journalists, more journalists from different walks of life, and more importantly, you break the chokehold that current rich individuals have over traditional media. All those are things that opening government needs to deal with. Opening government gives me 3 broad claims, I think. Firstly, about the economic viability of journalists themselves. They argue that the inability to have a contract means that you have no economic stability, which is bad for the journalists themselves. The first thing I want to point out, that the lack of contract is equally and symmetrically a form of economic freedom for the vast majority of individuals. To the extent that in the past, journalism was an incredibly difficult industry to break into because of the high barriers of entry. What this does in freelance journalism is that anyone now can be a journalist. If you are a student who feels deeply about environmental problems, who has niche knowledge about that, you are able to write about it. If you are a working class adult who is working in, for instance, biochemicals, you have niche knowledge, you feel a desire to write these things without having to care about the profits. That is what can drive you into journalism. It's that unique diversity we bring that is important. But more importantly, I think the most obvious response here is that to the extent that most freelance journalists know that they will be freelance, they oftentimes therefore or have already made backup plans economically. That's why they oftentimes are individuals who have taken up side jobs. These are individuals who are doing it recreationally. More importantly, OG doesn't say this, but presumably the actual impact that they hint at on this argument is that fewer journalists necessarily translates into lesser outreach and therefore a decrease in quality of the media. The question we're pointing out here is that it's not about the number of journalists that enter the industry, it's about the kinds of journalists that enter the industry. In the past, when traditional media organizations were the default mode, you have white individuals who are educated, have a background with a BA in English, whose parents went to Eton and therefore they can continue to go to Eton, entering journalism. What changes on our side? Now your average individual on the ground, who might not be the most well-educated but still is educated. Now your individuals who have the most compelling views about niche topics that oftentimes might be taboo to a traditional media organization are able to write about it. I think this is important because this is the second thing that opening government tells you about quality of journalism. Their argument here is that there's an inability to have proper competition when it comes to freelance journalism because any and everyone can publish information. The first thing I want to point out is that to the extent that the mechanism that government relies on is one singular media organization competing with another, so the Guardian calling out the Washington Post, for instance, I would suggest that surely this mechanism of competition will be better when it's amplified to the extent of having more independent journalistic houses, more independent journalists writing by themselves. But more importantly, the argument that they are trying to get at here is that the inability for you to have a financial backing means that you're unable to engage in things like op-eds and investigative journalism. The first question I want to ask here is why are these things so expensive to begin with? If you're thinking about it, the chokehold that media has had over individuals has been broken by social media. The availability of things like whistleblowers through social media means that investigative journalism is not a huge expenditure that they have to talk about. But more importantly, in terms of things like travel grants, being able to fly white journalists into Somalia to talk to the pilots, for instance, I don't think it's an important impact in this debate because the comparative is not that nobody covers those news, it's that you get a local, somebody who has those lived experiences, somebody who knows how to navigate the dangers of a oftentimes war-torn area which is dangerous, who knows how to best represent that information to individuals who need it the most. That's the unique impact that we get on outside. I think it's incredibly unfair for government to assert that's a unique benefit they get. Then they tell you things like, but you get sensationalization of information, which is bad because now you have so many journalists, but all are bad. First things first, this is not true. To the extent that these are individuals who know very well that freelance journalism will not get them that much money, they are writing purely because they are passionate about their interest. But more importantly, I don't think it's true to suggest that freelance journalism is equated to things like conspiracy theories. There is still an incentive for you to be accurate. What changes here is that you have more of an incentive to be nuanced. Because when you're in a singular media organization, there is no competition. The only person you compete with is your fellow journalist, who is equally beholden to the same editorial controls that you are beholden to. There is no incentive for them to break out of the run-of-the-mill mill. The comparative here is that when you're a freelance journalist, you are competing with every single individual out there who has a keyboard, who has a pen. That means you have to provide the most nuance possible. You have to give the view that is most compelling, that individuals are most likely to see and that genuinely reflects their accurate experiences on the ground. The last thing I want to point out is that the premise of opening government's case is that just because these big singular media organizations have money is necessarily well utilized. Why is this not true? 3 reasons. Firstly, that even if this money is present, you're oftentimes beholden to things like journalistic directions. That's to say, if your company is owned by Rupert Murdoch, you necessarily have to write in ways that pander to his interests, because otherwise your head isn't on the chopping block. Secondly, it oftentimes means that you're subject to editorial controls, who oftentimes think more about how profitable this news article is as opposed to how important it is for you to get a piece of information out there. That's to say, if you are, for instance, an individual who is writing about LGBTQ individuals who live in a conservative society, that is oftentimes going to be vetoed by your organization. I think that's not necessarily a good thing. Closing. Anything? Opening.
If you consider the vast majority of freelancers won't be successful, why don't there be valuable unregarded impact get coverage?
If most people know that freelance journalism means that they have a high chance of failure and they still choose to enter anyways, perfect! Then it means that everybody tries. You get more diversity of viewpoints. They are all trying to compete to be the best. The comparative is that no such incentive exists on your side. Lastly, what does Han Yang tell you and why do I think it's important in this debate? We prove to you 2 things. One, that this benefits journalists themselves, because otherwise unrepresented minorities can now write about topics that they are passionate about and that truly is important. But secondly, we also benefit society at large to the extent that the argument about echo chambers is completely neglected on their side. I would suggest that the ability for individuals to pick and choose journalists who have a diversity of viewpoints as opposed to having to always be beholden to that singular media organization who oftentimes has their journalistic direction set by who is paying them money, who is giving them journalistic directions, for instance. All those are things that mean that the echo chamber that media times oftentimes has on individuals' lives is broken. But lastly, I want to point out here that anything that Closing Point can possibly tell you about the importance of media shaping society is what uniquely happens on our side. Media is a mirror for society, and the only way that mirror can be meaningful is when journalists come from all walks of life. That's the unique benefit you get on opening opposition. So proud to oppose.
May I start? Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Closing government's path to victory is going to be very simple. We are going to prove to you that this trade-off necessarily means the fall down of traditional media and that it also means the fall down of people getting accurate information. This is something that is highly assertive from opening government. We are going to be much more structural to this, especially on the point, what is the concrete impact of, how to say, having accurate information and all of this and all of these kind of things. Okay, first of all, note that what are the structural issues with freelance media? First of all, we tell you that once you're opting out in this kind of job, in this kind of industry, you are much more likely to spread gray areas of truth or opinions that are radical, opinions that are controversial, and all of these kind of things. I have 3 structural mechanisms here. First of all, notice that regarding freelance media, it is a very high barrier of entry. It is much higher barrier of entry than anything else. So, if you work for Guardian, they are employing a lot of people. It is not that hard to get a job at media house, especially if you have a lot of media houses that are competing against each other and all of these kind of things. As a freelancer, you have to be able to succeed on your own. You have to be able to create the name of yourself for yourself and succeed on your own. Notice that top half concedes that one of the main platforms of these people is internet. Notice that the algorithm is a priori preferring already established names and all of these kind of things. Therefore, it is very hard to break through. Second of all, notice that these people, in order to break through, they want to target unexplored territories. That means that they're probably going to be targeting, you know, people who like don't have their voice represented in traditional media and all of these kind of things. They're probably going to be, you know, catering to radicals and all of these kind of things, therefore, you know, persuading this kind of opinion. Thirdly, note that they are not working under the contract, therefore their income is not stable and contingent under the contract. Their income is contingent on them, you know, selling, you know, this specific story or getting enough clicks and all of these kind of things. Therefore, there are like, there's a much stronger, like, you know, structural incentive for them to, you know, like be to do this kind of things. Also, this is also engagement with opening opposition. You probably are not going to be able to have a side job because side jobs are incredibly like exhausting. You have to work 9 to 5 if you want to be competitive in traditional media. If you want to be competitive, you know, in freelancing, you have to be, you know, able to dedicate yourself and all these kind of things. Writing articles is not that simple. You cannot like do these kind of things, you know. Fourthly, note that these people lack empirical tools to determine truth and, you know, determine what are the objective facts of the case that you're running and all of these kind of things. Secondly, why this means fall down of traditional media. Notice that the motion requires a very, you know, motion requires a trade-off, X rather than Y. That means that you have to make a trade-off. That means that basically two things. First of all, that, you know, traditional media has a lack of human capital. You have more educated people being easily persuaded into becoming freelancers rather than trying to get a job at Guardian or something like that. Second of all, that means that more people are like subscribing to freelancing media than to the traditional media, which means that you're not, you know, like getting subscription, you're not getting money from these kind of people, they have less money to operate and all of these kind of things. Third of all, notice that what also happens is the traditional media, to the extent becomes freelancing, it is going to be more like affordable for them to, I don't know, like buy articles from freelancers than to actually, you know, employ, how do you say, like, no thank you, than to actually employ people who are going to be working there, you know, 9 to 5, which is quite problematic because you're literally having erasure of journalism as a job, as, you know, for these people who have these careers to have, you know, like constant income and all of this kind of things. That means that, you know, their income is not, you know, like contingent with a contract. Their, you know, like financial situation is much more volatile and all of this kind of things. Third of all, why are you easily persuaded into freelancing? Like, so like the trend of this means that we are, like, when we are talking about this entails that we are like potentially just like highlighting all of the like beneficial stuff about this kind of job. Like, you know, you can work for yourself, you're not constrained with a company, all of these kind of things. We are, you know, like having all these like flashy stories of like freelancers that manage to find their success and all of these kind of things. So you can like very easily be persuaded into getting this kind of job, into like persuading this rather than to, you know, like backtrack it and all of these kind of things. So this is essentially, you know, like why there's going to be a fall down of the traditional media. This also means when they're talking about the monopoly of the media, traditional media companies, this is more likely to happen on your side of the house because the first companies to come down once this becomes a huge trend are companies who are not monopolies already, companies who are actually, you know, competing against, you know, big conglomerates and all of these kind of things. They're, you know, pressuring them into becoming more better and more accurate and all of these kind of things. The concrete harm of this is lack of accurate information, and I'm going to get into that, but before that, opening.
When conservative media outlets with their brand and reputation publish an article...
You have to talk to me, I don't hear you.
When conservative media outlets with their reputation publish an article about vaccine skepticism, that article has greater legitimacy than if it's a 30-year-old Facebook mom with radical thoughts, because people are more distrusting anyways.
Yeah, so okay, so like the problem is that it is much more likely to write false news on your side of the house because like people are going to eventually find empirical evidence that, you know, like vaccines are not going to turn you autistic and all these kind of things. Therefore, you're going to, you know, lose your legitimacy as Daily Wire or Fox News or whatever, you know, like right-wing media exists today. Therefore, I think that you're like much more likely to have, you know, like you know, like the anti-vaxxer shit started, you know, because like the people, you know, started doing this kind of things. Okay, you have a lack of accurate information on our side of the house. I have already explained why, you know, like this is something that is necessary like for traditional media and why you're not. But also this means that, you know, like traditional media becomes worse. So traditional media is going to be opting out into, how do you say, more scandalous news in order to, you know, like break through because like they're, you know, have to fight on the new territory and all of these kind of things. Why why is this essentially problematic? Notice that every single person you're making decisions for your life based on the information that you have and based on the predictions and calculations that you can make, taking all of the information that you have into account. Notice that every single human being has different preferences and wants to, fulfill them. When you are making decisions, you have to be able to cross-reference as much, accurate information as possible in order to be able to make the best possible decision for your life, in order to be able to, fulfill your pursuit of happiness. Notice that we are extending on why accurate information, why traditional media is important, and we gave you a bunch of structural mechanisms why traditional media is falling on your side of the house. Notice that the opening opposition is symmetrical. People can talk about their experiences, share their experiences without this necessarily being, journalism and all of these kind of things. Very proud to win from closing.
I'm not going to down for my whole speech. That is so nice. That is not what I thought about your speech. Cool. I was missing something. Timers are important. Okay, I will begin my speech panel in 3, 2, 1. Journalism is dying and has been dying for decades. Governments in this debate have a burden to prove that this is likely to change, or alternatively, as CG try and unfortunately fail, to prove that it is a result of freelance journalism. Before I get into my first analysis of what killed journalism, aka the internet, and how freelance is the solution, as well as extend on my top half on why we actually get funding and are therefore able to create good journalism on our side, let's start with a single extraneous rebuttal to opening government. Opening government talk about job security. 4 quick responses. Insurance, freelance journalist unions and collectives, long-term planning of your own career, working with multiple revenue sources, all of these mechanisms ensure the job security, which we will also analyze positively within my speech. Let's get into the first portion of positive analysis. What killed journalism? It's like video killed the radio star and the blogger killed the newspaper delivery man. How did this happen? First, the competition became a lot harder. It became a global competition. Now I need to compete against the BBC and the New York Times and the best, most well-funded journalists from across the world. At the same time, the interest of people decreased dramatically. It looks like decreased attention spans because of the internet and the social media we consume. It looks like having more access to entertainment and specifically infotainment on platforms like YouTube, Netflix, or Spotify. It looks like the fact that simply more prosperity and security in the world since the end of the Cold War make people less curious about what's happening in the world. As a result, there was a decrease of 80% in paying customers. Many of these sources had to become free. Many of them, like The Guardian or The New York Times, decreased the cost of a subscription to $2. Local news channels all shut down or got bought out by the Sinclair Group, meaning that they all parrot the same crap that Fox News does. Newspapers went from being daily to weekly and from being paper to being digital only. Along with this, the income methods of these companies changed. They now need to have A, a large quantity of viewers because each one of them pays dramatically less, and B, most of their revenue now comes from ads, which means that they want shorter articles, more clickbaity articles that they're constantly trying to push in your face, and they want them to appeal to the lowest common denominator so that they have maximum clicks. So how then do they manage to remain funded, aside from decreasing significantly their quality? A, they decrease the pay and number of employees and their expectation from each employee. The exclusive metric of the quality of each employee is the number of clicks and views they get. They want scoops, they don't want investigation. The only sources that remain well-funded are the ones that are funded by billionaires. Bloomberg, Fox News, they have a clear political goal representing the interests of the corporate elite, maybe their political friends. What does freelancing then do? It changes the balance of power between journalists and employees. Freelancers, instead of working in this horrible working environment, can now research things independently, write an article, and then choose where to sell. It's like doing your research and development alone versus for a company. You have the copyright for it, and then you can go to many different newspapers and offer your article. You can go to your favorite platform. There's no oversight, no control of what you're forced to do. And freelancers even have the ability to not work with traditional media organizations at all. Before I get into how freelance gets funding compared to single paycheck employers, yes, opening.
Look, getting quality news in terms of investigative journalism requires things such as long-term financial background, like you being protected
Okay,
against
I'm
losses.
talking, that's literally my extension now. How do we get funding on our side? So let's start with a bit of framing for you. There's an important burden that OO miss. Without proving that freelancers are able to make a living creating quality journalism, we can only assume that they still have to write the same shit for the same media organizations, and the only thing that changes, as OG says, is just their job security decreasing. So, what do we give you? First, competition. Each article I write can be offered to 5 different relevant newspapers, and whoever offers me the most money gets it. Each article gets funded based on its specific value. If no one wants to buy it, I can self-publish. I have a YouTube channel, a Facebook page, my Twitter. I can create a podcast that I publish on iTunes and Spotify. That means that A, I get ad revenue directly, and note, since ad revenue is in both cases the main source of income, it's much better to get it directly. And secondly, the high viewership itself makes me more valuable to established media as it gives me a reputation. But more importantly, active fan funding is just the greatest thing that happened in the 21st century. This looks like Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee. It means that channels like The Young Turks or Some More News, tons of niche papers that are able to be free access because a small percent, maybe 5, 10% of their viewers actively decide to give them money, and as much money as they can. Why is this likely? A, many people get exposed when the content is free, engaging. Some of them benefit a lot from this, and that already means that I get funding from them. But secondly, people emotionally connect to their sources of information, especially when it's not just the name of a newspaper, but an actual specific journalist whose face I see and voice I hear all the time. People don't like feeling like freeloaders. I don't like feeling like someone is giving me a ton week by week and I'm not giving anything back. What, I'm not gonna give them the cost of a coffee every month? This works. We see YouTubers and bloggers and entertainers and journalists, anyone who provides the public with a free service and doesn't get paid by government is fan funded. But even beyond that, they can create new media organizations. The barrier became much lower. I can work with other freelancers, so I don't have to commit to 50 employees working full time and make sure I have the backing. I can start small and slowly scale up and down without hurting anyone's job security. I can appeal to specific populations. I can have the Harlem Report or a feminist view on everyday news. I can invite only my freelancer journalist friends who think similarly to him right. I can get to choose which of these platforms to use. So I can work with multiple traditional media organizations and a blog and self-publish and cooperate with other freelancers and access public funding, and I can switch between these all the time. What are our impacts here? First, we get more job flexibility and security. I'm able to decrease my work hours. I'm able to change the intensity of topics or which topics I focus on. I can take a break for a month. No one's gonna fire me. And on the flip side, like any gig economy job, I can increase my articles. If I want to save up, I can decide to write 12 hours a day and publish everything. And that means that not only am I secure, I'm never gonna get funded, I'm never gonna find myself on the street, I can also very easily control how much I work. Secondly, it gives more job enjoyment. Having less dependence on a single employer means that I don't have fear. It means that I don't have to listen to authority. It means that no one's sitting on my back. No one's forcing me to write clickbait. Journalists hate writing crappy information and crappy news. Imagine if you were a debate judge and your job was to give the crappiest, most clickbaity debate call in every round. And finally, we get better reporting. I can see which piece and which topic I'm researching is best for a 30-minute video, YouTube video, which is best to send to the New York Post. I can even write a version of it that I get paid for and publish another free version on my blog or a video that goes further in depth. I can connect the two of the things and reference myself, meaning that I can actively gain from multiple sources of revenue at the same time from the same article. Because we have better, happier journalists making better media. Go with closing opposition.
very simple structure, OG, CO, OO. First, in the terms of how do we win over the OG. It might seem similar to some parts of the analysis, perhaps our case, but it's different in the terms of providing the actual comparative, why it's better for you as an individual to be offered certain rights, and why it's even worse on a scale. But also note the analysis that comes from Paola's speech in the terms of how you are persuaded in the first place to actively join freelancing, and why the information is inaccurate at first is something that is prerequisite for you to be harmed in a certain way, and also is prerequisite for you to make a legitimate decision in the first place because of the asymmetry of the information. This is really crucial because this proves that you're likely to make a wrong decision because of the trend existing, because you only see the successful ones. You want to be like that. You have positive bias as an individual. I can do that kind of shit because I think I'm really good. At that particular moment, you're likely to actively throw away positive comparative, which might give you safety, and embrace this one. This is important. Additional part of the mechanization that we bring you is falling apart of these normal media companies. This means that if you have many freelancers, people actively, rather selling their articles and those kinds of things, at that particular moment, there are less of the jobs for these individuals that essentially want to have the positive comparative. It's not about you making fucked up decision in the first place, because from the opening government's case, OP can say, okay, but you can jump back in. I think this analysis is crucial to show that you don't have a way back in at the point of which all of the funding is lost and you're simply falling apart. I think at that particular point, we were adding the missing links and actively showing to you how in the terms of the magnitude of harm, many people are likely to be harmed on their side of the house, and many people are likely to not make good decision with good calculus in the first place, which on a principle level is something that shouldn't be, upheld. I think this is how we win over the opening government. Also, I would say the important extension in the terms of weighing on the quality of information. Note that Paola adds in here even a little bit to the comparison to the opening government. Opening government says, oh, they have money, now they can do research, they can have quality information. I think Paola, with the idea of competition, actively having the rising media houses pushing you to do certain things better, the idea of overview of the market, generally being able to follow the trends and those kinds of things, that's media houses, in order how will you achieve the good information in the first place, and why this is the most important thing for the viewer to be able to see in it. The importance of that point was also on our side of the house. How do we win over the opening government? Now onto the CEO. I think the problem with CEO is they completely ignore the problems that we outline. They believe that you live in some kind of utopia, you're a privileged individual. If you don't get the job, that's fine, because you can relax, you can do whatever the fuck you want, etc. Note that this perhaps is something that is true for the privileged individuals inside of the society. Note that this is the comparative of opening opposition when they say, oh, you go to Eton and now you're working as a journalist in some huge media house, these people are bad. I think closing opposition's case specifically underlines why these people are gonna be the privileged ones, at the point at which they completely ignore that every single other disprivileged individual won't be able to do this. Additionally, every single benefit that closing opposition wants to outline is on the premise that you will be successful. Note that they don't mechanize why you will be successful. Note that specifically our extension in terms of how algorithms work and how generally you're likely to be still stuck in the bubble of the things that you essentially want to click, meaning if I'm conservative and I'm actively reading conservative articles, I will not, see liberal articles or some ideas out of the box. If I like feminism, I'm not necessarily going to see certain things that are not connected to the feminism. And also the idea of most clicks being the ones that are on your feed in the first place. At the point of which you have successful people, and this barrier of entry functions in a way that you're not able to actively even get to someone's feed because you're not famous enough, you're locked into the digital system they themselves say is a part of the comparative, and you're less likely to succeed. I think then this compares to, I think in the status quo, without the trend, or just like counterfactual, without the trend being, rising and those kinds of things, You, as a privileged individual, still have the liberty to do this, meaning that all of these benefits will still exist for these individuals on their side of the house. But the problem is the fucked up information that you get in the terms of when this trend is rising, and why some of the individuals will either lose their jobs or will actively, be pushed into something they cannot get away from. I think we should, on the weighing, prioritize those that are more disprivileged. Open, yes.
So, the CG premise is that individuals are coerced into being a freelance journalist, but this is tenuous with all of OG's good mechanisms in terms of how it's incredibly financially unstable, because if it's true, then that's a good check and balance against that coercive pressure.
And you say that is not true. I would say the analogy is with influencers, and also with being an actress in Hollywood. Like, people often with those kinds of jobs in the terms of how you can achieve something, some kind of popularity, some kind of attention, are not really realistic. Meaning that even with startups, like people often do startups, even though it's like 20% success, 25% success rate. This is what generally people do, and it's problematic because as we explained, the asymmetry of the information, the people that you're seeing, like you're seeing the most successful influencers on YouTube, you believe that you can do that because they were average Joes, but they were able to get to the top. You are not hearing about the stories that are not on the top because of the structural reasons that we explained to you. This deals then with the opening opposition's case, because note that they wanted to bite the bullet. Oh, even if they fail, this decision is completely correct. We told you why this decision is illegitimate in the first place with the asymmetry of the information. We told you why this decision didn't have the calculus they wanted to believe, worst case scenario. But we also told you how you're actively taking away the agency of the people that essentially want to do this other kind of the job, at the point of which you're simply throwing them out of the market because of the freelancing. At that particular point, I think in the terms of the magnitude, we're able to show you why many of the individuals opening opposition wants to protect won't be successful, and why many of the individuals will actually be fucked up with the development of things, and why traditional media is falling apart. Because of all of these things, please vote CG.